Okay, good evening, everybody. Last week we were learning about the separation of challah. Tonight's Aloch and Tanya. We're learning the separation of challah, and we discussed the amount of flour that you need to do with the bracha, without a bracha. Now, what happens if you're baking things with water? Now, let's talk about the liquid a little bit. What happens if you're making cakes or challah, but you're adding other liquids also? So the din is like this. If the majority of now let's say you have enough flour, we discussed the 3 pounds, whatever it is, with the bracha, without the bracha. So let's say you have enough flour. And now the question is the liquid content. So if the majority of liquid is water and you have enough flour, then you separate challah with a bracha. You separate challah with a bracha. Because the majority of liquid is water, and therefore, by the way, that cake would also be hamaitzi most of the time. Now, what happens if the majority of the liquid is not water? Then you separate without a bracha, no matter how much flour you have. So if you have the right amount of flour, and you have different liquids, and the liquid's majority is water, so then you separate challah with a bracha. What happens if you have the majority of liquid is not water? You separate challah without a bracha, even if you have the proper amount of flour. Now, what happens if there's no water at all in the ingredients? It's eggs, oil, juice, whatever. There's no water at all. Then the din is that you cannot separate challah unless if you add a few drops of water, mamish a few drops of water into the liquid content, so then you could separate without a bracha. But if there's absolutely no water in the content of liquid, you cannot separate challah at all, no matter how much you have. So again, if the majority is water and you have enough flour to separate challah, you do it with the bracha. If the majority is other liquids, then you separate challah without a bracha. If there's no liquid and there's no water at all in the ingredients, so then what you should do is add a little bit of water to be able to separate it without a bracha. Because again, the majority of content is not water. Now what happens? Now we learned the amount is 3 pounds, whatever the amount is, 3 pounds, let's say, or 12 cups, or, things like that. What happens? I want to bake that amount of challah, but my mixer that I make the dough with isn't that big. Let's say it only holds 10 cups of flour. Okay, I make the dough with the machine, but it only holds 9 cups, 10 cups of flour. But I'm going to be making a second batch, another 10 pounds, let's say. 7, 8 pounds. So then the din is, you put the dough together in a pan, you cover it with a towel, the covering goes over the sides also, and that combines both doughs together, and then you're able to separate with the bracha. So in other words, let's say you need 3.5 pounds to make a bracha, and your machine only holds 2 pounds, and you're going to make 2 pounds of flour, and then you're going to make again 2 pounds of flour, but you made them separately, but you want to bake them all together, you want to do it together. So then you put both doughs in a pan, you cover it, make sure the covering goes around the sides, it could be as a towel or whatever, and then you're able to separate with the bracha. Another thing that happens pretty often, another interesting halacha. By many cakes, if you bake a lot of cake, and you need to separate challah without a bracha, with a bracha, whatever. But the problem is many cakes are, the batter is pourable. It's a liquid batter. So how are you supposed to separate challah before you bake it? You can't separate challah because it's a liquid dough. How are you going to separate? So then the din is you have to separate after you bake it. And then again, you put everything together in a pan, and then you cover it. And then if you're able to make a bracha, you make a bracha. If not, you separate without a bracha. There's another interesting din, and that happens like this. What happens, somebody baked challah for Shabbos, and they forgot to separate challah. They forgot to separate challah. Now comes Shabbos. What are they supposed to do? So here there's a difference, halachically, between Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael, Chutz La'aretz. The din is like this, that you're not allowed to you're not allowed to fix things on Shabbos. If you take something that's not usable, not edible, you can't make it edible on Shabbos. If you remember, I remember if we learned it in this class, you're not allowed to table dishes on Shabbos. Let's say you have a dish, you didn't put it into the mikveh before Shabbos, you have a mikveh within an Erev or whatever in your house. Are you allowed to immerse dishes in the mikveh on Shabbos? What's it dependent on in halacha? Halacha says it's dependent if tabling dishes is biblical or rabbinic. There's an argument in halacha. If tfilas kelim is biblical or is it rabbinic? What's the difference? If it's biblical, the dish is not usable because the Torah says you can't use it until you table it. Therefore, by me tabling it in the mikvah on Shabbos, I'm making something unusable, usable. That's the concept that's called tikkun moneh. I'm fixing something broken. I can't use it. I'm going to put it in the mikveh. Then I could use it. So I'm not allowed to do that on Shabbos. If you hold that biblically, I don't have to table dishes. The Chachamim, the rabbi said you have to table dishes. So then it's really a keli already, because biblically I'm allowed to use it. That means biblically it's a vessel. So then if I table it in the mikveh, I'm not making unusable usable. It's just a Chacham said you have to table a dish in the mikveh. Bottom line is Alter Rebbe Paskins in Hilchos Shabbos that tabling kelim is biblical. Therefore, according to the Alter Rebbe, and according to most opinions, by the way, you're not allowed to table dishes in a mikveh on Shabbos. Now, what's the question with challah? Okay, the din is in Eretz Yisrael, you are not allowed to eat challah, the bread, the challah, until you separate challah from it. It's forbidden to eat it. You can't eat it until you separate challah from it. So therefore, if I have a challah that I baked before Shabbos and I forgot to separate challah, in Eretz Yisrael, you would not be allowed to separate challah on Shabbos, and therefore you would not be allowed to use that challah on Shabbos. You'd have to get somebody else's challah, matzah, whatever. The challah you baked, you're not allowed to separate challah on Shabbos because in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to eat the bread. I'm calling the bread the general term. Challah, bread, cake, whatever it is, until you separate challah. So therefore, I can't separate challah because now I'm making it edible. Before it wasn't how I am. So therefore, you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. And in Chutz La'aretz, though, outside of Eretz Yisrael, there's a very interesting halacha. That is, you can eat the bread as long as you leave over at the end a piece that you could separate challah from. Okay, you can separate challah from that piece. But in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael, where the law of challah is not as stringent and as strict as it is in Eretz Yisrael, so outside of Eretz Yisrael, like in America, whatever, you baked challah on Friday and you forgot to separate challah. So the din is you can use those challahs on Shabbos. You're allowed to eat the challah on Shabbos. You have to leave over a piece at the end, And from that piece, you have to separate challah. With the bracha, yeah. If you had enough dough, then you can even make a bracha. Yeah, but then you don't have to separate the dough on Shabbos. And also by separating the dough, even if you do it on Shabbos, you're not fixing anything because you ate it already. So it was allowed to be eaten. You didn't fix anything.
It's not dough, it's challah.
I understand, but we learned before. If somebody didn't separate, let me go. Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to say that din right now. Anyway, that's the din. Now let me discuss. I should have said this first. What happens during the week? You made challah, you made cake, whatever, and you need to separate challah. What happened was you didn't. This is Thursday afternoon. You baked challah, okay, for Shabbos, and you forgot to separate challah from the dough, and now it's baked. And now it's baked. So what do? L'chatchila, you have to separate challah from the dough. Before you bake it, you have to separate challah. The only time we say you don't have to is if it's a liquid batter, like sponge cake and those types of cakes. So then you can't separate it before you bake it. Then you separate after you bake it, if you have enough flour, and like we learned before. But what happens if somebody did not separate the challah from the dough, and then they bake the challah? So now they have, let's say, 5 challahs, enough dough, enough water, enough everything. The din is, you put them all in a tray. You cover them with a towel protruding on the sides, and then you separate challah with the bracha. So you're allowed to separate challah b'diavad after you baked it. The case I just mentioned before this was when you forgot to separate challah now with Shabbos, if you're allowed to do it or not. So in Eretz Yisrael, we learned that you're not allowed to do it. In Chutz La'aretz, you could not separate challah. You can eat the challah, leave over a piece at the end to separate challah from, and then you're fine. But the same thing applies if somebody by mistake, and this happens very often, by the way. People bake challah, and they forget to separate from the dough until after it's baked. So then the din is, you just put the things together in a pan, because it has to be mitzadif min amuk, if it's called, surrounded in a box, so to speak, and that's why you need the towel or the cover to go around the sides. And then you could separate from it after you baked it also. The problem is you're going to ruin a complete challah, because now you're going to separate a piece from a complete challah, so therefore you will be missing, that challah won't be complete anymore for that Shabbos. Another interesting din when it comes to challah, and this happens more than you think. I remember the story the first time it happened that I was involved in. The first time I got to Shiloh was, by the way, was in the girls' school here in the city. They had a challah bake for the girls in the city. I mean, for the school, it was a class, a few classes together. The older classes baked challah. And this, by the way, I wouldn't say once a week, I'd say every other week, I get the Shiloh from people about what they do. They take the dough, they separate challah. Somehow, that piece of dough that they separated challah from got mixed by mistake back into the other dough. And you don't know which piece it is. And then you don't know which piece it is. What do? And in order to be bottled in challah, it has to be bottle 1 in 101, that you're not going to usually have that. So there's a very interesting halacha. Sometimes it's too late to do this on Friday. You need to get a bezdin of 3 men. Preferably one of them should be a rabbi. And let's go like into Ataris Nedarim. You ask, tell them what happened, and you ask that you want to retract the separation of challah that you did. In other words, this challah is forbidden to eat. You have to burn it. It belongs to the kohen. Today we don't know who a kohen is, so we burn it. but you're not allowed to eat it unless it becomes nullified 1 in 101, not 1 in 60, 1 in 101, which is rare. So then what you need to do is have a bezdin. It's a form of ataris nedarim. You say, I want to undo the challah separation that I did. The bezdin says, undone, undone, undone. It's not challah anymore. And then you have to separate again. Now, do you do it with a bracha, without a bracha? Is a big argument in halacha, if you do or not. So ideally, probably the best thing would be not to make a bracha, because it's a doubt whether you should make a bracha when you do that again. So that's the shaila, if a person needs to do it or not to do it. Because once something is a gift to the kohen, it becomes like a certain form of hegdish, of holiness. And therefore you have to undo the holiness, because otherwise it's not nullified. And then any piece that you're going to eat, you might be eating that piece of challah. So then that wouldn't be permissible in any way whatsoever. Now there's another issue that needs to be discussed when it comes to baking challah. And that is public challah bakes. When people what happens when people do a challah bake? So they have a lot of people, let's say they have 100 people. This became very popular lately. People do it for brachas, people do it to bring Mashiach, people do it for sick people, people do it for various different looking for a paper. Okay. No. Okay, so the halacha is as follows. What happens usually is, let's say you have, let's make it 50 people at the challah bake. And they take a piece of dough and they give every woman a piece of dough. And they want to teach them the law of separating challah. The problem with that is that each woman doesn't have enough to separate challah. Not only that, the din is that when you make the original big dough, okay, what they do is like this. They make a big dough, massive dough, and then they give out pieces to all the women. And most of the time, the women take it home to bake in their houses. That's usually what's done by the holiday bakes. The problem is, even though you baked you made a massive dough, nevertheless, the din is that if when you made the dough, your plan was to divide it amongst people, that everybody will get a small piece, that dough is not obligated in challah anymore. That's the halacha. There's an argument in halacha, but Tzemach Tzedek talks about it, others talk about it. The halacha is that you are not obligated to separate challah, because when you made the dough, the intent was to divide it up amongst 50 people. So nobody is going to be getting the amount of proper challah. So what do? So a lot of times people, by the way, make this, it's a big mistake people make. They don't know this halacha, and they make this big dough, and then they give out small pieces of challah for everybody to make their own challah roll, whatever. And they tell them to separate challah with the bracha, and you're not allowed to make a bracha. It's a bracha in vain. Not only that, you're not allowed to separate challah, because if you're not obligated to separate challah, you can't separate challah. So what do? So the halacha is, so I'm talking now, I'm not going into a lot of details in the bracha, I'm just saying a practical thing. What needs to be done by the big challah, mega challah bakes is that a woman from the big dough takes for herself, it could be the rebbitzin, the head of the program, or anybody, they take 3.5 pounds of dough for themselves. That they're going to keep. Okay. Now, because it's their dough, that dough they're not giving out to people. Let's say they bake 10 pounds of dough and they're giving everybody a quarter pound. I don't know what they give. And then, but the person herself keeps for herself over 3 pounds to be able to separate with the bracha. So the proper thing in halacha to do by these challah bakes is one person makes the bracha. Why can she make a bracha? Because she's separating a sheer challah for herself. Okay? Then everybody else does not have to separate challah, and they definitely cannot make a bracha. Again, there's ways of going around to do it, but it's not a practical way of doing it because people are going to get the wrong impression that even on a small piece of dough, you're able to make a bracha, and that's halachically incorrect. You cannot make a bracha on less than a shear. And the chiddush in halacha over here that people are unaware of, that even though you made a big dough, but if the big dough was intended to separate it into little pieces, then the din is you can't separate challah from, you definitely can't make a bracha. So that's the only way. So people want, I know the issue, they want to tell the women to do the mitzvah of challah, and they're trying, to get them to do the mitzvah, but you got to do it right according to Allah, or else you're doing something wrong because people are going to be making a bracha levatala. Okay, now the mitzvah of challah, by the way, one last din before we move on. One last din over here is the mitzvah of challah was given to the women. That doesn't mean only she could separate challah. Men could separate challah too. It's just usually the minig is that the woman does it. But if a man is baking challah or a baker bake challah, they separate challah. You have to separate challah. The same thing with lichbenshim. It was a mitzvah given to the woman, but if the woman's not home, the man has an obligation to light. Or as it says in Shchuch, if a woman is not getting her act together and she's not ready to ben shlicht on time, it says in Shchuch the husband should go ben shlicht, and that's it. So even though the mitzvah is given to the woman, both of challah and adlokas haner, in addition to the halacha taras mishpacha, family purity, nevertheless, the din is a man can also separate challah if there's no woman in the house, and a man definitely go separate challah. Otherwise, people might use the challah and bake it and do all those things. Okay, that's basically it in the practical dinam of challah. From there, we're going to move on. I'm going to skip the tabling of dishes at the present, and we're going to go for a few minutes. Start the dinam of it's called Pas Akum, Bishul Akum, Cholav Akum. These are all rabbinic halachas. Now, there's a few things the Chachamim forbade because they didn't want Jews and the non-Jews to assimilate. And food is something that brings people closer together. So therefore, halacha the Chachamim didn't want that people should get closer together. Therefore, the Chachamim said that if somebody, a private non-Jewish person, bakes bread for a Jew, the Jew is not allowed to eat that bread. It's rabbinic, but a Jew rabbinically is not allowed to eat that bread. Why? Because it might cause assimilation. But there is another concept that's called pas palter. Pas palter, bread, pas is bread. Palter means a baker. Pas palter means bread that a bakery bakes. A baker bakes. Meaning, he's not baking it for you. He's baking it for whoever. He doesn't have you in mind when he's baking the bread. He's a bakery. He's a baker.
Jew or non-Jew. Jew or non-Jew.
What?
The pas
No, I'm saying pas palter is we talking if a goy is a baker.
A goy, okay.
And a goy is baking challah for the public. That is what's called pas pauter, bread of a baker, which halachically is not as strict as pas akum, when an individual guy bakes bread for you as an individual or for themselves, and then you want to eat. That's, by the way, even if all the ingredients are kosher. Flour, water, that's it. There's nothing else. It's kosher. Everything. We're not talking about kashrus over here. We're just talking about even if everything's kosher. But a guy bakes the bread, a Jew is not allowed to eat the bread. If it's pas pauter means that it's a baker baking the bread. So that's a little bit more lenient than pas akum. So even though in our world, in our circles, we're very machmer on it, but there are opinions that hold that because the reason doesn't apply that much, because there's not going to be so much assimilation, okay? Nevertheless, the Chacham said you shouldn't do it. Unless, halacha says, you could be lenient if there is no kosher bread. There is no pas Yisrael. Or, halacha says, if the pas pauter tastes better than the pas Yisrael. So then there are opinions in halacha that, right, you could be mekel. Even then, halacha says in Aser Simei Tshuva, in the 10 days between Rosh and Yom Kippur, even those people that are lenient a whole year should be machmer when it comes to those 10 days when you're supposed to be more religious. You should be machmer even on pas pauter. In our circles, we're very machmer on pas Yisrael, and we're not mekel, we're not lenient in pas pauter. Now, it's late already. We're going to start Tanya, but I just want to mention, this applies, by the way, a lot of the kosher supervisions, OU, OK, Chavke, I mean, you name them, all of the big ones, are lenient in pas pauter. That means you can have cookies that will have an OU, but it will not be pas Yisrael. You can have bread that has an OU or OK or Chavke or whatever. I'm not going into advertisement of any companies. And yet it's not pas Yisrael, it's pas pauter. You can't say it's forbidden to eat, but you shouldn't eat it. And we'll stop here and then we'll go, Mitzvah Shem, to Tanya right now.